Today is Friday, February 2nd, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm here again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how's your Friday morning?
Mr. John Robinson. It is, and I am excited. I mean, I love working here and being part of the work, but just because you're part of the work doesn't mean you don't get excited when Friday shows up. So I am looking forward to the Sabbath break and this weekend's, but it's been a good week.
For today.
All right, today, I appreciate your encouragement to do this. We're going to build on some things I discussed in the sermon this past Sabbath, and do think that it has a special significance for younger people living in the particular kind of world we're living in. Today, we're going to talk about conspiracy theories, taking a look at the sort of thinking and non-thinking that often goes along with them, and the mindset that God wants us to have about them.
I thought I might mention here at the beginning why I thought it would be good, because I did encourage Mr. Smith. It was my idea in the sense that I brought it up and suggested it, and even though that Mr. Smith here gave this sermon here locally, so we have a lot of Charlotte listeners, of course, and so many of them will have heard the sermon. But you and I talked about it even afterwards, and there were, you only have so much time. You talked about some principles that you wanted to get to that you just didn't have time for. And I thought that there was still plenty of work that could be done on that we could build off that sermon, and some topics we could hit and just expand on a couple of things, and kind of a little bit less about the theories themselves and more about what they should mean to us. Yes,
I think so. I appreciated your encouragement in that regard, and to our teens and young adults who are listening, we do want to talk about principles. We're not here necessarily to debunk an idea, definitely I'm going to state an opinion about some ideas, but not many, because there are broader principles involved. And while we wanted to focus on that in the sermon as well, and I don't know that I'm really going to get to so much of the stuff that I ended up cutting for the sermon for time, because I love talking about rational thinking and logical thinking, and that might be a good topic on its own later. I was telling you recently about I think it was you, about the idea of a dichotomy and dilemma, and splitting the horns of a dilemma,
right.
and Christ using a dilemma, and those opposing him using a dilemma. Then he split the horns of that. I love structured thinking like that, but some of that might be better for another time. I do think there might be some overlap for those if they actually heard this, something like this, related to this rather, this past Sabbath in Charlotte. But at the same time, the principles are broad, and in particular, you guys listening, teens and young adults, you are growing up in a world where distrust of almost every institution around us is, I don't know if I can say an all-time high, but it is incredibly high, that the default for most is not to trust the institution you're hearing from, whether it's government, for that matter, churches and religions, whether it's education. In such an environment, it's very easy to fall victim to some ideas, and whether ideas are true or false, because we're going to talk about that, whether some of these ideas are true or false is ultimately irrelevant for many of them, but whether they are, it can start to appeal to us in certain ways where we're not actually thinking clearly, and we're losing sight of the vital principles we have to have in front of us.
Because we all have tightly held beliefs, and so sometimes they overlap with a theory that lends itself either for or against your deeply held personal belief, and it can quickly get you off into, But at the same time, we are certainly not saying conspiracies don't exist, are we, Mr. Smith?
No, we are not. We're not validating every conspiracy theory, and yet at the same time, and by the way, what is a conspiracy theory? I should say at the beginning. A conspiracy theory generally is the idea that there's a group of people, and I'm just going to in the most generic way possible, a group of people that have a particular goal that they're trying to hide from others, and that they are manipulating certain things here and there to achieve that goal. They have a conspiracy. And does that ever happen in human history? Of course it does, right? Some of you have played board games where you and another player, that's part of what you're trying to do, is you're trying to, maneuver the circumstance. The fact is, human nature makes conspiracies a given, that humans are going to conspire. There's a reference in Proverbs chapter 1 right out of the gate where Solomon is talking to his son. And he says in Proverbs chapter 1, and starting in verse 10, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, 'Come with us,' let us lie in wait to shed blood. Let us lurk secretly for the innocent," without, I kind of like to say it with a kind of creepy voice, "Let us leak secretly for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, the grave, and whole like those who go down to the pit." It says in verse 13, "We will find all kinds of precious possessions. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Cast in your lot among us. Let us all have one purse." Now, in that particular case, part of the warning is that never trust shady guys like that, because they all don't really, they're not part of the team. They want to serve themselves. But another part is the fact that that's just real life. When people have a common goal, whether it's evil or, for that matter, whether it's good, they work together with other people to try to achieve that goal. So human nature should teach you to expect some level of conspiratorial organization in the world, and we have examples. The Bible talks about, we don't need to turn there for some of these verses. What are some of the ones in the life of David, Mr. Robinson? We were talking about some of them earlier.
Conspiracies in the life of David?
Yeah, like for instance, in terms of the throne and...
right. Yes. Well, the one that jumped into my brain is one that was not his imagination, and that was Saul had conspired together with his followers to try to kill David.
Yeah.
That was a real conspiracy.
Right.
Also, his son Absalom was like the definition of a conspiracy.
You bet, working with Ahithophel and others to try to secretly take over the throne.
I mean, we tend to put that under the category of coup, but when you go and read the story of it, because Absalom was very, very clever, frankly. He would sit for a time and say, that there was a king in Israel or a judge in Israel who could hear your case.
That's
and
right.
Slowly built his followers.
Ahithophel, primary counselor to King David, corrupted him and got him on his side behind the scenes.
Also, that is Bathsheba's grandfather.
That's right.
So that factors in.
Man, there's all sorts of... It just reads like a modern day conspiracy.
And then even right there at the end, as in David's waning years, as he's fading from the scene, his brother Adonijah also plots.
Solomon's brother.
Yeah, Solomon.
Right.
Sorry.
Right.
Decides they're going to run a conspiracy to take the throne by just claiming that they're the king. And,
So very real. In fact, if you go through in the Bible, you'll see various kings involved. Joash was killed by one, and there's people with different. These names are often used more than once, just so you know. Joash was killed by one. Amaziah was killed by one. King Shallum actually led one. Hoshea, real conspiracy Hall of Famer there, led. The Bible credits him with two conspiracies. If you look at it, really the kings of Israel and Judah kind of loved themselves some conspiracy. So no one is saying that they never happened. Even historically, some that might sound unbelievable. Like it is demonstrated fact that there was a time in President Kennedy's administration, President John F. Kennedy, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff presented a plan to him because Cuba was a problem. We had a growing communist presence in Cuba. You had Fidel Castro there. And it's a matter of public record that they put together the possibility of doing some false flag attacks where the U.S. government would orchestrate terrorist types attacks in Miami and Florida and possibly Washington, D.C. that would involve potentially bombings and actual deaths. But they would blame that on Cuba, and it would use it as a pretense to go and invade. Now, John F. Kennedy did not go through with it. He decided that was a bad plan for whatever cause. And anyway, regardless, that's called Operation Northwoods. That was actually...
It's on the record, right?
It's on the record.
Yep.
That's an actual thing. So we're not trying to say that these things never happen.
Well, haven't you found that... So, in fact, I pulled up the definition. And the definition of a conspiracy is a secret plan by a group to do something unlawful or harmful. And so the way you know that that's what's going on when a group of men get together is if they're smoking cigars, right?
Yeah, I did my terrible impersonation there in the sermon, but I do picture a cigar in one hand and a brandy in the other.
It does feel like that,
doesn't it? A smoky room. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that established that, yes, people do act together in concert in ways they believe will benefit them and potentially to get around the rules or to reshape the rules, in their favor. Okay, that said, that does not mean that something is a conspiracy just because you hear about it and it seems to match evil human nature.
Yes.
You know, that it's so quick to say like, oh, you know what? That's exactly what people would do. But that doesn't mean it's what they have done. And we have to have some, what we'll talk about in terms of the kind of filters that to put in place. But for every, I'm making up a number here. I'm not saying it's true. But still, it feels, I'll say this, it feels like for every one conspiracy that might be true and historical fact, there's 3 or 4 to 30 or 40 that are completely false, or could be true, may not be true. You know, there are some questions.
Hey, what if you read your list without comment?
Okay, I'll do that.
The audience think what they think.
Okay, I'll do that. All right.
Okay.
I'm just going to read 4.
Okay.
1, our government, at least in the United States, possibly other world countries, is actually being run by lizard people.
Right, and not to sound like it's even like there's a whole theory behind it.
Like
subterranean. They live in in the earth, subterranean. We would say lizard, but reptilian.
Yeah,
I think is
reptilian.
more common.
Right. Maybe
And
even
there's
shape changers or all sorts of things. That's big time conspiracy theory.
Infiltrated our government, and then everything that you don't like that the government is doing now is because of
the lizard people.
Yeah. Yep.
Another one, that NASA is hiding the fact that the Earth is actually flat.
And it wouldn't even be merely NASA, right? The conspiracy is far wider.
Oh yeah, that's part of what you have to do when you analyze it. Another one, that the moon landing was faked. Matt Walsh on his podcast just earlier this week, he said he got baited into it, but he accepted the bait, and he was talking about it, whether the moon landing was faked or not. And then I have to say I disagree with all of those, just so you know. But we'll talk in more detail. I couldn't help myself. I had to commentary. But here's one that comes up from time to time, that President John F. Kennedy's assassination was not a one-man job, right? Generally, it's believed that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. But there are a lot of theories that somebody else could have been involved.
That's one of the ones when you look at actual facts that we have, there are things that definitely don't add up. So it's not hard to, at least it's reasonable to ask the question, is the official narrative entirely accurate?
Right. Is it partially the truth, and is something else not? Is it so just put those out there as examples. And I'm going to evaluate. The first 3 are totally false. There's no lizard people. And by the way, when I say this, I'm not just saying because it sounds absurd on the surface. I don't recommend diving into and studying every theory that comes your way. Part of what we hope this will help you build are some filters to help you realize, you know what, I'm not going to waste time on that. But at the same time,
your position as executive editor, and you're writing articles and being on the telecast, you're a target. You're a target for this. Like, people who have these ideas want to convince you.
Yeah.
So the reason you get so much information about it.
I do. And like the flat Earth, I'm not recommending people try to study that for any reason, but honestly, I have. And it has helped when people write me on the magazine and say, look, I know you haven't seen what Buzz Aldrin said in this interview. And it's like, no, I have seen it more times than you can imagine. I know you haven't looked at this. And it's like, I can't fathom you're going to come up. Let me say this. In years, I've yet to see someone present something truly novel that I've not actually seen. Actually, same thing with the moon landing. And I get some people say, hey, man, what about the cameraman that was on the moon in Apollo? How'd they pan up that camera? How'd they get through the Van Allen radiation belts? I'm not going to get all the ideas out there, but I have literally gone through those and spent personal time going through those. And so I'm not saying I dismiss those out of hand. I do believe we should have filters in our life. And I think that what we cover in the latter part of this podcast will help you put some filters in place. But I just want to say, as someone who's been in a position to have to go, some people you need to go the extra mile with. And especially when you're in the ministry, that's part of your job sometimes, if you can, is to go to, sometimes you can't afford the extra mile because you got to give that extra mile to somebody else.
Well, what do you think are some real root causes of why people find some of these conspiracies attractive? And what are the various reasons you've seen?
Oh boy. Okay. That's a really good question. And it falls into a lot of different categories. First, that we do live in an environment where it's hard to trust anything, right? It's
more information than ever, and probably less trustworthy.
Oh yeah. People say that part of what's great about our current day and age is the gatekeepers are gone. You know, if you want to write a book, and that book could be the most brilliant thing mankind has ever seen, other than the Bible, and no publisher would take it because it's so radical, but it's true and it's amazing. And if only people would read it, we'd have anti-gravity flying cars and the rest. You can now go to
motion machine.
That's right. You can go to Amazon. You can publish it yourself. You build a website. You know, everybody can see it. So it's YouTube channels. On the other hand, if you have utter garbage that you want to publish, and it's completely not true, it's absolutely insanely wrong, but you passionately believe it, you can do exactly the same stuff. You can publish your own book, get a nice cover, get artists willing to dress it up pretty. You can have websites and the rest. Daniel, through Daniel, God prophesied that this time would be a time when knowledge or information and knowledge would be increased. What maybe we didn't anticipate in the past was how that, kind of like when that one doctor said that Dr. Meredith liked to cite, when she would say half of what we know is wrong about but we don't know exactly which half it is.
That.
You can say that about information. Like you're being flooded with information, but so much of it is not necessarily true. But just because something's not true doesn't mean it isn't convincing. So that's part of it. Is we're in a day and age where we don't trust experts anymore, and we have such access to information, but it's so much.
Well, and then we can become our own experts.
Oh yeah, and we can kind of certify ourselves, so to speak. Also, when you start grabbing onto some of the, let me say this, some of the appeal of some of these ideas is also the idea that, and it's just human nature, that when it's kind of like gnosis, you know, like the Gnostics, you know, there's an appeal to knowing something that other people don't know. You feel more enlightened. You feel like, man, I'm so much more open-minded than other people. You know, I see through the veil to all these things. And that the fact is, we in the church do see through some false ideas, right?
Yep.
But we have to be careful we don't get caught up in patting ourselves on the back for that kind of thing, because it is a terrible pride that we can reward in ourselves.
Yeah, no, I was going to
unearned.
I was going to add to that an observation of an old experienced minister who's no longer with us. I mean, he died, he didn't leave. And you could argue that being called by God and coming to the church and learning so many things, that we've believed were not correct, and learning about the truth, you're kind of, I know something most of the rest of the world doesn't.
Right.
And so they would already have a little bit of that mindset. And then what's more attractive than being among the chosen people? To be the chosen people within the chosen people. So you're like, wow, how much other stuff do we not know about?
Yeah.
And this is where I think when we, towards the end, get to our points of how to filter these things, we'll filter a lot of those right out.
Yes, I think so. I think 100%. The two other things I'll keep in mind that I'd like to recommend in terms of your question about why are some things proliferating. One is, and this sounds contradictory to the way you might think it is. You might think we've become jaded because we have experienced so much, and that makes it harder to convince us. Honestly, we've actually overall become more gullible, I would say, because when you're bombarded by all these things and you can't trust experts anymore, then you actually become open to far more than you should be open to. And next thing you know, you say, you know what, it really might be that all of that is a lie, and here this thing is that, and I'm just going to be open to believing that. And we the whole idea that you should keep your mind open, but not so open that your brains fall out. I think we've reached a point in society where a lot of folks, our minds are so open, our brains are falling out, and we actually have a cultural encouragement to think that way, because one of the reigning philosophies of the day, and I did not want to be distracted by this, so I'll hit it very briefly, postmodernism essentially encourages you to reject reality for the way you want things to be, or for a theory that you think fits, even if it doesn't truly fit. It doesn't make a difference. Your truth is what matters, not everybody else's truth.
That reminds me of, if I may interject, it was a commercial by Samsung, and it was for the big virtual reality headsets you can put on.
Oh, yeah.
And the tagline of it was, create your own reality.
Yeah,
and I thought that's a little on the nose.
And I know that, for some of us, if we get caught up in some of these ideas, that I'm not doing that. I'm just focusing on but the thing is, when that is your culture, and increasingly it is our culture where we want to create an environment where we can just live in our own realities, it does begin to affect us in subtle ways we don't pick up on. I said one more thing. I want to have two more things. One is, and because I wanted to highlight what Mr. Wahovich talked about in our last podcast. If you haven't heard that, I hope you'll go listen to it. If you're watching on YouTube, we'll definitely link to it as the video at the end. But in terms of education, we don't actually teach people to truly think. We've said we're trying to teach people to think critically, but regrettably what that means is think in such a way that you want to throw out old and traditional ideas. What it's not is actual logical thinking, where you take an idea and may discover, in fact, it's actually true. When you look at more critical thinking in terms of how it can be taught, it's too often just, hey, just don't accept what you've been told before. You need to think critically, but the message isn't really to think and prove what might be true. It's think critically in such a way that you'll throw out that which has been called traditionally moral or good and accept something else. Yeah. And honestly, the word critical thinking shouldn't mean that. It should be, I want to actually understand the truth. It doesn't make a difference if it's traditional. It doesn't make a difference if it upholds an objective morality. I want to know what's true. And we don't teach young people to think in that way. There's no more, at least it's rare, kind of classical education in terms of what does it mean to have a rational mind that knows how to put a logical argument together. Right. Instead, it's follow your heart. What is your heart? I mean, how many things have we seen in Disney and other things? What does your heart tell you that's true? Man, Jeremiah 17:9 says your heart is a lying jerk, and you should not trust it.
When I was 21, okay, and I won't go into the circumstances, but like we were going through memory scriptures, and that was one of them, and it was supposed to be a really like poignant, savage one, and I don't know, I didn't get it. Like I got it, I understood it on its surface, but man, 30 years later, it's like, wow, that no more truer words were spoken than that. Yeah. It makes me think of another one, by the way, another scripture that I've meditated on for decades, not continually, but is the warning not to move the ancient landmarks. Like there are just certain established principles and truths that we don't lightly cast away, and like the modern thinking seems to be throw everything out. Let's rethink everything. You already went into that. We had somebody you and I, we mutually know a few years ago, felt like the church was way off and we just needed to like scrap all of our understanding and like restart, like reimagine the Bible from the beginning because we don't have it right. And it's like, no.
Wow, really? Yeah. You figured that out?
Yeah, there's all this collective wisdom that many men that you and I know and have respect for, and some who are not alive anymore, for generation to generation has passed down established truths. But no, we should rethink all of it. Because
right. You need to go down to the very beginning, because I, in my young 20s, whatever the case may be, has somehow figured this out. That's very frustrating. The last thing I will say, because there's lots we could say, but I do want to move on to these other points, is that frankly there is a great conspirator in the world, and that is Satan, the devil. And the devil is coordinating things in the world, right? He has the ends he wants to achieve, and it's mainly the destruction of mankind. But as a result, we do see society going in a particular direction. And it is true that the devil is working in this world. That doesn't validate every potential human organization here and there. Honestly, he works in the hearts of individuals, corrupting them in various ways. But that's another thing that can actually, because we do see patterns. Right. We do see things happening. But if anyone shouldn't be too quick to fall into, that's got to be the work of men doing something. No, it could be the king of Tyre, so to speak. It really could be the powers behind the throne that mankind even unwittingly have given themselves over to.
You and I have talked about this a lot over the years, and I've had my own observation, which is, we're always trying to interpret current events around us and try to keep an eye on larger trends and where we are, because the church is tasked with warning modern day Israel of their sins, right? Cry aloud, spare not. Right. Okay. When we've stayed with really big picture milestones, signs to watch for, is when we've been the most accurate, if I can put it that way. For example, I'll never forget, I may have told this story before, but that's a sign you're getting older, right? When you retell your stories. I'm retelling all my stories. Oh man,
I retell so many of my stories.
It was, I can remember the grade exactly. I was in 6th grade, might be 7th grade, and my history teacher, and at the time, East Germany and West Germany were separate because they would have been split up after World War II.
Right.
The Soviets and their huge apparatus was in place, and the idea that Eastern Germany and Western Germany would ever get together seemed like beyond a long shot, that was never going to happen. And I remember our teacher asking us if we ever thought that they'd be reunified, and I was literally the only kid in the class that thought they would be reunified. You know why I thought they would be reunified? Because Mr. Armstrong said they would have to be reunified eventually to fulfill the long-term prophecies in the Bible, and he was 100% accurate, because that happened probably
late 80s, around 89,
15 years later. Yeah. And so then, to your point about the conspiracy, that Satan is behind things and he is trying to have us go a certain direction. We know from reading Revelation that there is going to be a huge end time, largely economic system that you can't be a part of unless you've taken on certain marks. Okay. So we know that there is, Satan has a conspiracy to form a collective that you can only be in by agreeing to be a part of it. Right. The details of how we get there are all speculation.
Oh,
right?
They are.
We can see a bunch of things, and we can probably rightly just say, well, this sure would be helpful for a system like this, and it's headed in that way. But let's all be honest. We are guessing.
Right. We know where things are going. We know the overall arc of prophecy. But the details could be anything. I came across it yesterday because I discovered a box of them that I had left in my office, a small box with Mr. Rod McNair's article about all the tech that's growing is in 2020, back when a lot of this was advancing related to COVID and such. And he straight up talks about, the potential of these things to be used in certain ways. Are they going to be used those ways? We don't know, right? But we can guess on those things, but the guessing on those things shouldn't distract us from the reality that we know, which we'll start talking about reality and stuff here as we get to these steps. By the way, I'm going to have to get this out of my system, Mr. Robinson, and you set me up, and it'll be something I probably regret. But when you talk about being in 6th grade, maybe 7th grade, I'm an old musical guy from my theater background, so I couldn't help but think, I'm in 6th grade, going on 7th grade, and now I'm going to regret that I said that.
No, I like it.
Anyway, for those who've never seen Sound of Music, you're missing literally one of the greatest musicals of all time.
It really is.
Yeah, it really
is. I'm
is.
not a musical guy, and I was not, especially as a kid, and I love Sound of Music.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Okay, that was a commercial, I guess.
I did occasionally go, we're singing again, but it was all good stuff.
It was. All right, that said, that was our brief interlude. All right, so let's jump into some keys when conspiracy theories
come up. Okay, so we're being bombarded with information. We don't know what to trust. There are some true conspiracies out there, but what did you put your statistic out? There's a few that are true, a few that are maybes, and a lot that really have no real sound evidence.
Basis
no
or
basis.
Evidence, right.
Yeah, that's a good way. So how do we?
Okay.
Is there a way? What are the methods?
Yeah, I want to just recommend 3 areas, and they're kind of broad, but 3 areas, things you should keep in mind to help you deal with ideas that come along. And hopefully you can also use these as a basis of creating some filters in your life. Don't let someone tell you, hey, the Bible says that, a man shouldn't answer a matter until he hears it. At the same time, God doesn't expect you to entertain every single idea that you're presented. The world is trying to shove so many ideas down your throat. You need some filters in place that say, look, true or false, that's not worth my time.
Earlier you mentioned Christ splitting the horns of the dilemma. And I think of Christ because the Pharisees, the teachers, the experts in the law,
right?
They love to debate. What does the Bible call them? Doubtful things. And they wanted to draw him in. They tried constantly to draw Christ in. But if you overly broadly characterize his responses, he almost always went big picture.
Oh yeah.
He didn't get into the details. Very common. Sure, it worked. So this problem worked itself into this position where we are now, but in the beginning it was not so. He goes back to there's big time principles. Mr. O'Gwyn used to say, If you want to know how things should be, go back to how God established in the beginning. So the first 5 books of the Bible as really the foundation of the rest of the Bible is built upon in many respects. There are just things we can bypass quickly as very, very unlikely because they violate core principles that we already know.
Absolutely. Big picture thinking is actually one thing you can put right there at the front, in terms of not letting yourself get caught up. And these will be sort of subparts of that. The first thing we want to recommend in terms of addressing these kind of ideas and the filters you build and how you deal with them if maybe you need to dive in for some reason. The first one, and it's primary, is sound biblical understanding. Start with the Bible. That alone will kill a lot of conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Lizard people.
Yep.
Nope.
Quickly, I first encountered them. I was telling you this earlier. A couple guys I used to work with way back in the early 90s, and they had some a conspiracy show they listened to, and they would tell me all kinds of stuff. And when I got to the reptilian people, I immediately dismissed it. Immediately. There's not even a shred. I know some people actually try to take some out of the Bible, that there's some evidence for it, and then some of that's early misunderstandings of some Genesis scriptures. But no, that are there vast, intelligent, highly technically advanced aliens out there in the universe? No, there's not. The Bible doesn't have any concept of that in it at all. So
yeah, just drop that.
Yeah.
Even if someone presents something tantalizing, I had someone in the church a long time ago, back in the Worldwide Church of God, present like a book, and they told me, "Oh, you gotta get this book." Well, I got the book, and because he actually loaned me a copy, and it presented what looked like documents that were what's the word? It had the black lines through them, so you don't know it's saying this and you don't know it's saying that.
They're redacted.
Yeah, redacted.
Yeah.
There's the word. And honestly, it's it wasn't enough. It was not
unredacted
enough.
Would not change your
exactly.
opinion.
The thing is, this is such a large thing. It's not worth my spending time on. It's not worth actually letting get through that filter.
So I think a good example of this, which we encountered when COVID flared up and the idea of the vaccines. Why can we clearly dismiss any notion that vaccines are going to be the mark of the beast?
Right. Because, and by the way, I was actually want to bring this up when you mentioned there's certain marks people will take, because the mark of the beast is Sunday keeping. It is violating the Sabbath to worship on Sunday instead. And the church has taught that for ages and demonstrated that. It's one of our core understandings about what's coming in prophecy. And so if someone wants to come up and say, hey, you know what? You know what's actually the mark of the beast? Vaccines. The vaccines are the mark. It's like, you know what? No, it's not. Yeah. And I don't see any need to spend any time on that whatsoever.
Also, some people misuse Job to prove there's a flat earth.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That's exactly right. I want to give that. So in cases like that, it's a matter of the reason it says just not the Bible as the first point, but sound biblical understanding. So a good example. Let's take a look
Which
at.
could apply to so many things.
Yeah, it does. There was a reader at the magazine once that was a flat Earth believer and just passionate about it, and was very frustrated that we were saying the Earth is round. And he, in a lot of ways, he fit the normal pattern for a lot of not just flat Earth conspiracy theorists, but a lot of different theorists, where he presents a lot of information, and even if you debunk them, it doesn't change anything. There's always more information, right? And you could debunk them all, and then eventually he'll never address the actual debunking. And then if you really give them long enough, they just come back to the same points because they never really went away. And anyway, this was, for instance, one that I've heard him and I've heard some others. And this I will say, because let me just say scientifically, I want to put this, because the point here is about proper, sound biblical understanding. But let me just say, because we're not going to take the time on this program, we could on a future podcast if you think it'd be helpful. Let me just say scientifically, and I don't mean science as in like NASA. I mean what you even can literally do with your own eyeballs as a physical human being. There's no basis to say the Earth is is flat instead of round. All the best evidence points to a round earth. But just talking biblically, which is where this guy was coming from, he says, no, I understand all that, but I believe in the Bible I believe in a flat earth because of the Bible. Well, here's a good example. Because it has to be, you have to understand the Bible the way God wants it to be,
which uses
understood.
a lot of metaphors. Doesn't
Well, it does. I mean, I am grateful for God's church in that we don't try to just turn everything in the Bible and spiritualize it away, and turn
all of Revelation.
Yeah, exactly. We turn all these things we avoid turning all these things into metaphors and stuff like others do, such that there's no like literal meaning. If you don't like what the Bible says, it must be symbolic in some way. I had a fellow once, a friend of mine many years ago, and I brought up the passage where Moses is allowed to see God's back. You know, it's one of those, he asked to see him, and he says, okay, I'll show you my back, but you can't see my face because no man can see my face and live. And I said, well, what do you think about that? And he said, he was not in the church. He goes, metaphor. I said, of what? I mean, it reads like a literal description of what happened. He said, I don't know what, but it's got to be metaphor. That's the only answer he had. So we are not of those who do that. However, we're also not of those who deny God his right to also use, whether it's symbols or metaphors or poetry for that matter. We don't have the right to force God on him what we want him to say. We must understand what he says the way he says it. And that's why when the Bible is being literal, we don't metaphorize, if you will, it away. We accept it literally. But that also means when he is speaking poetically, or using a word picture, we have to accept that too. In fact, I'll give Mr. Robinson here credit. We were talking about this message earlier. We did it as a podcast, and you did it as a sermon that can be found on the Living Church of God YouTube sermon channel. You talk about the angry Psalms. He goes through and talks about how some of those are actual word pictures God paints to make his point. Well, same thing here in Job. So the passage that my interlocutor, if I'm saying the word right, because it's a nice fancy word I like to say on occasion, he pointed out Job chapter 38 and verse 14, where it says, speaking of the earth, he says, it takes on form like clay under a seal and stands out like a garment. He's not the only one who's used this verse.
By the way, this sounding flat. I don't know, Mr. Smith, where are you going
that
with
was
this?
his point. A seal presses things down flat. And clearly, this must mean that the earth is flat. And if you guys don't take this literally, then you just don't take the Bible literally. And I said, well, just so our listeners know, my take on this with him is like, hey, look, let's set this aside temporarily. Do you take the Bible literally? Are you keeping the Sabbath? Are you keeping the holy days? Because if you're not, none of this matters, right? If you're not willing to actually obey God for what he says, then I don't care if you think the earth is made out of brown bananas. It is not. You're not doing yourself any good. It's not. However, you have to understand the Bible the way God intends it. So did he mean this to say that literally that's exactly that's what the earth is like? It's like a seal. It's flat like that. Is that, well, all you have to do is go up a little further. He's talking about, for instance, talking about the sea. It says in a little earlier, verse 8, or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? So I guess the sea, there's literal doors holding back the sea, and it came forth out of some kind of womb. In verse 9, he says, it talks about, I made the clouds its garment and the thick darkness its swaddling band. So I guess it has an actual swaddling band, like a baby. That's right. And then verse 10, when I fix my limit for it and set bars and doors. So now somewhere there's a place where the sea is kept back with like jail cell bars, like Popeye would be in a cartoon. I guess a lot of our listeners don't know who Popeye is anymore, perhaps. But it goes down further. You can look at other things. It talks about how, let's see if I can find the one I'd like to do. I really like, verse 22. He's talking about snow and hail, and it says in verse 22, have you entered the treasury of snow, or have you seen the treasury of hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? Well, he means the room is like a big vault, a big where you collect things so you can use them later. Do we literally believe that that's where snow comes from? Is there's a giant room where all the snow is collected and that the angels just shovel it out? God is clearly speaking beautifully and powerfully to Job. And the thing is, people don't want to take all of those verses literally. They only see the one that looks like it could support a flat earth, and they just take that one literally. And so when we say for this first point, which is it is a vital point, that you absolutely have to start with sound biblical understanding, because wisdom begins with the fear of the eternal. You have to understand the Bible for what God is trying to say with it, not for what we want it to say.
To cap this off, like I've learned to watch for certain red flags in my life. Like if I start to get really frustrated with something and it reaches a certain level, I force myself to step back and go, why am I getting so flustered about this? Okay.
Interesting. Yeah.
But so that's one of mine, red flags. But another one is, it should be a red flag to anybody in our audience if you really, by yourself, have uncovered information that only you understand.
Ephesians chapter 4 is a classic chapter explaining how God not only works to make sure there's truth present in his church, but how he works to maintain it, how he works to prevent us from being corrupted by other ideas. And it is not a solo kind of effort. God uses an organized church to teach the truth.
I mean, that's one of the largest purposes of a community. Why do we go to church every week and come together as a congregation? Because we kind of help balance ourselves out. And if you've discovered a conspiracy that you think is super important and nobody else is getting it, and you've shopped it to 7 people in the church and they look at you like you're crazy, that should be a red flag, I think.
Right. At the very least, be open to the idea that, maybe this isn't something of value. At the very least, right? But that's it. Okay, we started with that. We started with good, sound biblical understanding. So let's move on beyond. That's your first filter, right? If something violates the Bible, sorry, I'm sticking with that. Your word is true. No. That's right. John 17:17.
Let's waste no time on that.
Your word is true. Okay, so next.
Now, I know where you're going here, obviously, because we're sharing the same notes. But I have to admit, until a few years ago, I never thought about this dichotomy, and I really am glad you're bringing this out. This is an important one. So I'll set you up here.
Okay.
So we were sound biblical thinking, but just general logical good thinking that doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in the Bible per se. It's just good human. What can I say that? Good. Is there such a thing as
you
good
can.
Human reasoning?
Sure.
Okay. The important difference between evidence versus proof. So because people will say, well, prove it. And it's like, well, not everything can be proved. You can present a lot of evidence and draw your own conclusion. But like, in our case here, what's the difference between evidence and proof?
Okay. Well, in terms of sound thinking, you talk about, can you say good human reasoning? You can, but we have to understand human reasoning has been corrupted by sin. Mm-hmm. And so consequently, humans are we have a difficult time thinking clearly and thinking reason. And just because you're a philosopher and you've studied logic doesn't guarantee you're going to use it well. The sound-mindedness comes from God's Spirit, right? It's the spirit of power, love, power, and a sound mind. But yet at the same time, from Adam and Eve on, God did create us with a mind that can rationate, if you will, that can reason and think. But that is not easy to do. And so that is a whole nother podcast. But starting here from what Mr. Robinson recommended, these are just two things. We'll just say two things about sound, because we could talk about sound thinking all day, but because you see a lot of not sound thinking out there. But Mr. Robinson hit it. It helps to understand the difference between evidence and proof. And, I actually might turn it back on you because, well, first let me set the stage.
Okay.
If someone, I see someone, man, I saw this YouTube video and that guy proved it, whatever it is.
Yep.
I say, he just proved it. It's
I've watched a bunch of those.
That's right. And he didn't prove it.
Yep.
What he did was present you evidence. And you have to think of it like you're hearing this evidence and you're going to weigh it just like you would as a jury, because you've got someone presenting evidence. But you can't go back to how a man seems right in his cause till his neighbor comes and examines him. What about the other side of that, right?
Yep.
So, and again, we're outside of the realm of biblical facts that God has revealed, and we're talking about just the human reasoning realm. And you need to think of these more in terms of, so if someone says, man, here's why the earth is flat. If there's a place called the thermosphere above the atmosphere, and the temperature there is so hot, it would melt the metal that they show us in the spacecraft. There's no way a spacecraft would get through that.
So you're saying that the moon landing was fake?
No, I'm not. Or the Van Allen radiation belts. Like, man, have you looked at the radiation in the Van Allen radiation belts? It would kill anybody on the way to the moon. Okay, that person has not proven anything. I'm not even saying they're lying. All they've done is present evidence, just like a lawyer in a courtroom. Your task is to weigh that and not to draw some kind of hasty conclusion. In fact, you had an example, Mr. Robinson, and I just cannot remember it right now. It was a good example of the difference between evidence and proof, and you mentioned it like an hour ago or so. We were talking. Do you remember what that was?
So you were talking about how there's a lot of prophecies that we believe have been fulfilled, and there's certain things, there's certain evidence for it, and that again, that combined with our faith, we feel like certain things, and even then it would probably be on a couple of levels. Some things that we would feel there's a lot of evidence that actually proves that something's occurred. But one example I thought of was Dunkirk.
Oh, that was it.
The Dunkirk one.
Yes.
So the church has always had what I would maybe call a, I don't know, an oral tradition.
Yeah,
maybe
a strong belief.
A strong
I think
belief.
we can strongly believe something.
Because I do feel like this is true.
I believe it's true.
So for those of you who may be rusty on your World War II history, the Germans blitzed everybody. France didn't hold up very long at all. In fact, they pinned the remainder of the French army, and the British, I think, had 400,000 troops, and they're trapped along the coast there in northern France, there in the English Channel. And this weather rolls in. That's ideal if you're trapped because it gave them cloud cover, so the Germans couldn't use the Air Force, and then they foolishly wanted to use the Air Force to finish them off when they had tanks sitting there. But it doesn't matter. The English Channel, for whatever reason, became super calm, like a bathtub, and made it so that the British came over in generally what you might consider unseaworthy vessels and rescued a huge amount of the British troops and the French troops and brought them safely home. Okay.
Right.
But my point was, I believe that, and you believe that God intervened there for a larger purpose that he's working out and saved them. And some of it may have gone just directly towards the blessings towards Joseph's sons. And here he's helping them out in a major conflict. Okay. But at the end of the day, we have some really good evidence that that's God intervening, but it doesn't actually prove that was God intervening. I mean,
it's not a proof that it was. It's just evidence.
Yeah.
Right. That was exactly the example. A good example also that I do believe where God intervened was the Spanish Armada.
Right.
In fact, they struck coins, I think, that essentially said, God blew and they were scattered, right?
Yeah.
And so, we're presented with evidence, and there's nothing wrong with trying to draw a conclusion on that evidence, but we tend to confuse that with the idea of some kind of mathematical proof, like you've proven that 2 is greater than 1.
Yep.
Well, it's not the same thing. We're making decisions based on evidence, and that's really good because I do believe God intervened at Dunkirk, and I do believe that he intervened in the Spanish Armada. Yep. I will say at this stage that we had to be careful about filtering our evidence, and we have to obey the first step. For instance, I'll give us an example. The identity of Israel. I believe the identity of Israel is what it is because it's what fits the Bible. And the Bible is evidence. It's kind of a trump card evidence. Now, outside of the Bible, there's a lot of evidence you can present to support that. You can look at migration patterns. You can look at the timing of things. Mm-hmm. You can see which people were where on the earth at a certain time. I did that with Germany and Assyria in terms of editing the fantastic booklet that Mr. Rod McNair and Dr. Douglas Winnail did, going through all of that. That is a lot of supporting evidence. At the same time, people are going to throw evidence that disagrees with that. Evidence, kind of like the other guy in a court case, the other lawyer who's trying to say, well, yeah, but what about this and what about that? Don't forget the first filter. And for me, that's the clincher. When I look at the prophecies of the Bible and I look at the span of human history and I see all the peoples that have been involved, that has to be true. I don't see anything else. And so if I hear evidence that seems to counter that, I'm like, well, that's interesting. I wonder how that's going to resolve itself. But the Bible trumps that. And then there's other supporting evidence, of course. So we're talking about sound thinking when it comes to being outside those, but the thing where maybe the Bible is open to,
Yeah.
make sure you think about it
Yeah.
Rationally.
Well, I'm glad you clarified the filtering, because I thought the filtering was, if it agrees with my theory, I accept it. If it doesn't agree with my theory, I
That's a
dismiss
terrible
it.
filter.
That's not
That's
a
the
good
one we
filter.
want to use in life, but that's not the right one. Now, before we move on to the one that I know you and I want to end with, the perspective, still sticking with this second one, which is sound thinking. You said something the other day, and it wasn't fancy, but it was so plain that I do feel like it's an unasked question that should be asked more often. And the way you worded it, whether you remember or not, was just, does it make sense?
Right.
Like, we should take the time to ask ourselves in the beginning, wait a minute, does this make sense?
Yeah, because so I loved because as much as we possibly can in our lives, we want to everything that we take in as information filtered through a biblical perspective.
Right.
But even for those who don't have a biblical perspective, just the average person in the world, you still have a certain sense of built-in just logic, and one of them is, for me to consider your conspiracy theory, it needs to make some sense. And so to me, because I had a discussion a couple years ago, I won't say the circumstances so I can keep it generic, but an extremely intelligent woman. I can't remember what her profession was, but it was very professional. It was a relative of somebody, and talked with her off and on for about 2 hours. With my wife was there because we were traveling to the restaurant and at the restaurant, and she was heavily invested in the flat Earth theory. Okay. It was kind of interesting for me because I'd never heard somebody who was pretty well versed into it going into all the reasoning. Okay.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I said something along the lines of, well, so what? Like, so let's say the Earth is flat. Why does there need to be a conspiracy to cover it up? Which is the first time she didn't really have a good answer. So the conspiracy theory of that the Earth is flat, and people have from NASA, and the conspiracy is vast because NASA is not enough to cover it up.
It's got to be so much bigger than
so
NASA.
much bigger,
right?
But why? Like, and it reminds me of your sermon. I think I mentioned this last time you and I talked about it offline. Your sermon about evidence for Jesus Christ. What was that one called?
Did he rise?
Did he rise? And one of them was because naturally there's a lot of detractors to the biblical story that want to pretend like it was all a myth or something, even though there is, as you point out, a tremendous amount of evidence for it. If Jesus Christ's apparent death and resurrection is actually a large hoax, why did all 12 or all 11 out of the 12 disciples all die, allowing themselves to be martyred for something that was ultimately a hoax?
Right.
Like they were into it because it was real. It was real. Why would this vast body of people be invested in making sure nobody knows the Earth is flat?
That is, someone may have explanations. I've never heard a good one. And believe me, I've heard a lot. In terms of, both the flat Earth landing and the moon landing, kind of fit into this. Did I say flat Earth landing? Both flat Earth and the moon landing conspiracies tend to fit in this, but the flat Earth is perhaps the most painful of the two. And I should say, when it comes, for those who've never even heard, which we have a young audience, maybe not, that some people do believe the moon landing was a hoax. And for those who just may happen to be hearing this who believe that it is, for the record, I have spoken personally with one of the most preeminent moon landing hoaxers on planet Earth. I mean, he sent me his video. We've talked on the phone. We've corresponded. Anyway, regardless, I'm not just saying this because, I'm not going to. No, I mean, I gave this individual time. We actually looked at this material.
This guy is so legit. Buzz Aldrin punched him in the face.
That's exactly right.
That's how much.
So I do feel I should have some credibility, at least in the sense that, no, I have not dismissed those things out of hand. I've actually looked at them. But focusing on the flat Earth conspiracy in particular, the idea that, because if it is true, if the Earth is flat, then yes, there must be a vast conspiracy. And people want to say, yeah, NASA is lying, but it's not just NASA. You've got to look at the whole realm of accountants, construction workers, other scientists of a vast variety of sciences. You've got to look at programmers and journalists and doctors that are studying, the astronauts after all these different things. we know individuals in the church who actually work for NASA and have historically. It is a vast conspiracy, and you have to ask yourself, how has such a gigantic earth-shattering, flat or round earth-shattering secret been kept where not you have? I mean, look at all the things. You have to have people that eventually believed the earth was round until they got close enough, and their work actually, they had to be exposed to it, right? Kind of like if you imagine the Masonic Lodge, you eventually become a such and such degree. And, what is the filtering? Why does no one really know about that or talk about that? Why does no one realize once it got to that point, I just couldn't accept it? I had to turn, no, I guess they always get sucked in, or do they all get killed? That doesn't make any sense either. And you've got enemies like North Korea. North Korea, do you think Kim Jong-un would love to expose, they've never been on the moon, it's all a lie, the earth is actually flat, and yet he has to actually use a round earth, not he personally, to actually have a ballistic missile program. You don't have a ballistic missile program unless you actually understand the actual correct geography of the earth. There's so many levels in which you're telling me no guy in hundreds of years on his deathbed confession doesn't say, I've got to get all this off my chest. It's
been bothering me for a while.
It's been bothering me for a while, right? So anyway, the point is, does it make any sense to think that now is that proof that it couldn't be possible? Well, maybe not, but is that very strong evidence that maybe we shouldn't rush into believing something just because we've seen a series of good sounding YouTube videos? Yes, it doesn't. Some people call it the smell test. It doesn't pass the smell test. There's a reason your nose is over your mouth, so you can sniff something before you stick it in your gob. And we're not using the smell test with our brains all the time. And it doesn't rule it out. Something could stink and still be very good for you. Probably a lot of food is. However, before I actually eat it, I'm going to double check. Are you sure this thing that smells like a dirty sock is actually good for me?
I mean, we pasteurize milk now, and we never think of it. But like back in the day, it was pretty easy to avoid bad milk. You know how? It smelled terrible.
Right, exactly.
So you don't drink it.
Exactly. Okay, so moving on from just sound thinking, and maybe that should be a whole nother podcast in terms of how do you use reason? I have a book that I got to admit I've never read, but I've always been teased because the guy's a mathematical thinker. And the title of the book is How Not to Be Wrong. And I've always wanted to actually spend more time with it because I know some of the examples he goes into, which are really good. But honestly, both Mr. Robinson and I want to move as we kind of slide into home for this particular topic on something that is vitally important when it comes to sound, or not just sound thinking, but actually the approach we should take to these kinds of ideas. And that is godly perspective. And we're not just talking about sound biblical understanding. We're not just talking about sound thinking, but truly trying to grasp God's mind in terms of what he cares about and doesn't care about.
And, I might add godly, because, like if I view myself occasionally out there in the audience, and 16, 17, 18-year-old, maybe even early 20s, John Robinson. And what we're talking about here with godly perspective is, in this case for these, how does God view how we should view these things? Like,
right.
We're about to get into this really pretty quick, but it's sort of like, okay, so maybe we have uncovered a conspiracy that we feel like we've genuinely proven there actually is one. The question is, what should we do about it? And so you and I step back and go, well, what does God think we should do about it? How should we spend our time and resources when we encounter a conspiracy theory, Mr. Smith?
All right. In this case, we're going to mention two ideas that could be in that category, right? Because I think they help to illustrate this kind of thing. For instance, you'll hear a lot of people that will say, and this, actually I wouldn't even call this a conspiracy theory because there are straight up politicians in America that want to do this. But if someone says, look, I can prove it. The only reason they're doing all these things, the reason that they're supporting all these candidates, all this money's flowing is because they want to take away Americans' guns. They want to ignore the Second Amendment. And they want to pass massive gun control legislation that removes guns from every home in the United States. Mm-hmm. And they're hiding just how serious it is. Well, that sounds plausible. There's a lot of politicians that just cannot stand, right, firearms. Okay. But then one that might touch on more nerves. Someone says, look, we all know it's true. The 2020 election in the United States for president was stolen by the Democrats for Mr. Joe Biden. Mr. Trump actually won that election, but man, they added mail-in votes. They did this. The fix was in, and that election was stolen. And America, we have a fake president.
Yeah.
Here's some theories that a lot of people I know out in the world for sure can get fired up about. Right? There's clearly a lot of passions about those things. So yes, what should be our take on such things?
Two thoughts right off the bat, and I think this would be a mix of. Let's see, point two, sorry, I've scrolled that up, is sound thinking. To me, this is a mix of sound thinking and godly perspective. Okay, let's say, so they're trying to take away our guns, and which I would say that there is some evidence for sure that there's at least, there's calls for gun control all the time.
Absolutely. There's impassioned politicians and activists, yes.
And some states have actually aggressively passed laws. They've gotten laws in that really restrict the guns, okay? My first question would be, what are you going to do about it? Oh, they're not taking my guns. We're going to get into a gunfight with the SWAT, with the police, with the military. Are we going to keep our guns so we can shoot our way to the place of safety? I mean,
that definitely won't be the ticket to the place of safety, is it? Right.
And so then I step back to the other thing, which is what is the godly perspective, which is at the end of the day, you're not going to do anything about it, right? If they come around to round up guns, we're not going to do anything.
Yeah.
Let
me turn to the verse that says, "You'll have to get my gun when you can pry it out of my cold dead hands." It's
80s.
It's in the book. Yeah, Mr. Charlton Heston, a man I respect a great deal, but it's in the book of Hezekiah. Just kidding. There's no book of Hezekiah. That was one of my in-laws.
You almost had me for
jokes.
a second.
Yeah, there's no book of Hezekiah because we're not here to protect. As much as you might love the Constitution, if you're an American, God didn't call us to protect that document. That's not the focus of the church or a Christian. Same thing about the election. Let's just say for some reason, oh, you bet, we could prove that. Well then, okay. Let's just say for the sake of argument. Okay, sure. Let's just say that's true. What should we do about that? We need to get in there and we need pure elections. We need more honest elections. I don't see where God called me to make sure there's an honest democracy. In fact, democracies aren't even God's government. That's not actually something God wants.
Yeah.
Is that what we should focus the magazine on? Is it the gospel of pure elections and saving America by voting in the right guy? Is that what we're here to do? Or guess what? Is this just one more manifestation of how government just gets more and more, corrupt? If, again, just taking for the sake of argument, that's the case. If that were true, what are we as Christians called aside for God's unique purposes in the world? What are we supposed to do with that?
To your point, so what? What if a bombshell report dropped that nobody, see, that's another thing. Nobody in America will actually agree that it's actually the truth.
Right.
But let's say the majority of Americans had irrefutable proof that there was enough malfeasance in the election process that Trump actually did win, and that Biden's an illegitimate president.
Some ABC, the last news broadcast you'd ever expect to say something like that comes out and says it, right?
It's like the guns. I'm going to do nothing. That's too bad. Let's mark that down as yet another thing that we've done corruptly in our country. We can take note of that. But as far as what it means for how I'm going to spend my time and what my focus is going to be on, it's certainly not going to be on election meddling or election fraud or trying to get Trump back in the office. You and I have talked about another organization that keeps the Sabbath and the holy days that thinks this is a real problem. And as their message has drifted away from what we would consider the gospel message into, we need to fight for our rights and preserve our democracy, and things won't change. This is literally a quote. Nothing will change until Donald Trump gets back in the White House.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it is a group that consider themselves a holding up the banner of Herbert W. Armstrong, I think they would believe. And 100%. They have turned into, we have got to expose this corruption. We got to get, this man deserves to be in office. And it's like, wow, what happened to the gospel of the kingdom of God? What happened to the things we're actually supposed to be preaching about the world? This is undemocratic. What was the thing you saw recently? It's like, what are you saying? Donald Trump's the only politician who's ever lied?
Yeah.
It's like, wow. When do we put up for any lies amongst
We're
our
now
politicians?
in a position where we have to defend our guy because he lies.
Yeah. This guy, he may lie, but he's not the first one to do it, and he lies. He lies less than other guys. It's like, wow, how far have we actually fallen? Is that what the message of Jesus Christ is all about?
Well, I go back to what Mr. Ames said not too long ago. It was in a private conversation, and my point being just that it wasn't public. He didn't say it in a sermon or something. And he was referring to somebody who was off base and said they don't even understand the purpose of their calling. And that should be a grounding principle. What is God's perspective? Well, why are we called now as opposed to at another time or in the millennium? And it's because we are called to do the work. And we've said that many times on this podcast. And that is our aligning principle. So it was the Franklin Covey, which used to be a bigger thing back in the day. My dad paid for Audrey and me when we were newly married to go and take the Franklin Covey thing.
Oh yeah,
it was actually really good. But my biggest takeaway from it was, the guy who was giving the lecture, he had a way of really being succinct and clarifying things and putting it so you can understand. So if he comes to me and says, well, what's important to you? And I can say, a list of 5 different things. He says, it doesn't matter what you say. Give me your calendar, which means how you spend your time.
Right.
And give me your checkbook, which means what you spend your money on.
Right.
So how you spend your time and how you spend your money shows me what's important to you. And that's what we're showing to God. And if we spend a lot of an inordinate, look, I keep up with the news. I know what people have, especially conservative, independent journalists, if I can call them that, what they say about these things. And maybe they have some good evidence to support. But I am not going to, and we'll talk about it as a family a little here and there. Boy, that sure does seem kind of sketchy, but that is it. I spend no time at all in my weekly day-to-day operations invested in trying to make sure that anybody gets back in the White House, that anybody gets elected anywhere. I heard a very well-intentioned old-timer church member. He was relatively new, and this is decades ago. Talk about how he didn't know about this, okay? But we need to vote because these guys are picking who our judges are, and the judicial system's getting. I understood why he felt that way, but you know how much time God thinks we should spend getting guys elected so we can get good judges in?
No, man. None. That's right.
Yep.
Okay. In fact, this will be the last passage we'll probably focus on today, unless we're inspired to say something at the end. But Isaiah 8 comes to mind. And when it comes to conspiracy theories, I know that Isaiah 8 can be prickly for some because they might be concerned it can be misused or this. But honestly, when you take the verse, even when you put it in context, it is very plain. And so, setting the stage for Isaiah, things were not going all that well for the people of God in the land of Israel. And you've got the Assyrians, you got all sorts of stuff going on. And Isaiah chapter 8, we'll just read verse 12, but for those who want more context, don't worry, we'll give you some in a moment. God tells Isaiah in Isaiah 8, well, we'll start in verse 11 so you can see it as God telling him this. It says in Isaiah 8, verse 11, "For the Eternal spoke thus to me with a strong hand and instructed me that I should not walk in the way of this people." He's already saying, hey, the people are going in this one direction or this other direction. There's the directions the people are going. He's saying, I'm telling you to go a different direction. And it says, he continues.
You could apply that right now.
Oh, immediately. He says in verse 12, he says, do not, the Lord instructed me saying I should not walk in the way of his people, saying, verse 12, do not say a conspiracy concerning all that this people call a conspiracy, nor be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. Now let's pause right there before we get any more context and look at what he's saying. And what he's not saying. First is he's saying there's no conspiracies.
Because what is a way in which some people misinterpret this? Like they read that and they think...
Oh, they say, he's saying that, what is he saying there? He's not saying that there's no such things as conspiracies. Okay. And of course, that's right. Mm-hmm. He's not saying there's no conspiracies going on. In fact, at the very beginning of the podcast, we said, when it comes to ancient Israel politics, there was a lot of conspiracies going on, and how many people are making deals with, maybe it's they're hoping to getting over the Babylonians or getting over the Assyrians or whatever, or trying to replace this leader with that, or trying to maneuver so that this counselor. No, he's not saying there's no such thing as a conspiracy. That's not what he's saying. In fact, he's not even saying that the things that people are talking about are not conspiracies. He's literally commanding Isaiah, like in verse 11, don't walk in the way of the people. And what are the people saying? They're busy pointing out conspiracies. Verse 12 is saying, don't say a conspiracy concerning all that this people call a conspiracy, nor be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. He's not trying to say you got to live in a fantasy world where conspiracies never happen. He's saying that this is not to be your focus. When they're pointing all these kind of things out, you're to be pointing out something completely different. Of course, there's political intrigue going on. There's been political intrigue since there has been politics. Let's back up a little bit for some context. Let's go up to verse 9. He's talking about in terms of what's going on with Assyria and Judah and all sorts of things. And you get to verse 9. He says, be shattered, O you peoples, and be broken in pieces. Give ear, all you from far countries. Gird yourselves, but be broken in pieces. Gird yourselves, but be broken in pieces. Take counsel together, but it'll come to nothing. Speak the word, but it will not stand, for God is with us. So what's going on there? You have people who are plotting, people who are planning. This could even be the conspirators themselves. It's, look at them, they're doing a conspiracy over there. Regardless, God is saying, in the end, you know what really matters? I am moving in these things. Mm-hmm. That's what absolutely matters. It doesn't make a difference what the people are doing. Those who are actually standing with me are the ones that can be supported. Those who aren't won't. You can jump back down to verse 12 and 13, which we just read. Again, don't say a conspiracy concerning all this people call a conspiracy, nor be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. In other words, you shouldn't be bothered by these kinds of things. Instead, he says in verse 13, the eternal of hosts, him you shall hallow. Let him be your fear. Let him be your dread. Mr. Robinson just hit the nail on the head. It's easy to think these things, hallowing, what does that really mean, right? What does it mean, fearing and dreading? Everything Mr. Robinson said a while ago was such a good example. Jesus talks about that. He says, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. And that example he gave, what does your calendar look like? What does your checkbook look like?
So he was ahead of the Franklin Covey.
You know what? Guess what? Jesus Christ was ahead of the Franklin Covey company. That's exactly right. And we could say the same thing. What does your YouTube history look like? What is it that you're constantly spending time in and digesting? There's going to be a part of your heart there. And God is saying to Isaiah, don't focus on what these people are so focused on, the conniving and behind the throne, and they're going to do this and they're going to do that. He says, you know what? Instead, hallow me, fear me, focus on me. I'm the one who's actually acting in all of these things. They're so focused on their YouTube videos, the books they read, the web searches they're constantly doing. Well, you know what Jesus says? If that's where your treasure is if that's where you're spending your time, well, then guess what? That's where your heart is. And he's telling Isaiah, no, you should be focused on me. Hallow me, fear me, let me be your dread. Verse 14, he continues, concerning God, he will be as a sanctuary, but a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, as a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many among them shall stumble, they shall fall and be broken, be snared and taken. Again, there he's saying, whatever they're saying about conspiracies and stuff, what difference does it make if it's true or false? You know why they're falling? Because they have sinned against me. You know who can be protected? Those who are with me. That should be your focus. Those who need a sanctuary, who will turn to me, they can have a sanctuary. Those who don't, congratulations, they exposed a conspiracy. Unless they turn their hearts and repent, they're going to fall like
Yep.
the rest of them.
Yep.
And that's why part of what's so frustrating when we see this one particular organization that has virtually become a Make America Great Church of God is that it's like, where's the message that's supposed to be there? You know why the country's falling? It's not because of the person who happened to become president. It's not because whether the election was sound or not. It's not because we've left our quote unquote democratic republic values.
Mm-hmm.
You know what it is? It's because we're sinning. It's because we refuse to obey God. And because of that, this country's falling apart.
Yeah, Mr. Armstrong used to say, kind of make that point a long time ago. Like, what is man's fundamental problem? It's spiritual. It's minds clashing against minds. It's not that we're not practicing democracy correctly, or we're not practicing the American way correctly. And if we could just get back to that, that would like solve all of our problems.
Exactly.
What a good point about, at the end of the day, all our failings tie directly back to sin. I was telling my wife last night, because as you know, if you were here in Charlotte, a lot of people know I had a Bible study series here in Charlotte. If you get one, you do it for a whole month, so you do 4. So we went through, and how much I realized that the time of the Judges reminds me a lot of end time modern Israel in some respects. It feels a little like the time of the Judges right now.
It really does. Everyone doing what's right in their own eyes and no one really having it right. In the end, when Mr. Robinson and I talk about these topics, which actually we can honestly say is fairly frequently, it really does boil down to this last point we're trying to make. We need God's own perspective on what's going on in the world, and we need to care about those things that He is telling us to care about. And one of if I've seen a theme in some of what Mr. Gerald Weston has talked about in the church, it's that God isn't looking for people that are kind of parsing through His law, figuring out what they can get away with, or figuring out how they can satisfy their own wants. His target is so much bigger. He wants people to think like He does, to care about, that is God, to care about the things that He cares about, to desire the things in the world that He desires, to focus on the future that He wants to bring to the world. That's what God cares about. And I know Mr. Weston's focus has so much been seek the mind of God and don't settle for anything less. And once you do that, some of these, the stories, the conspiracies, the different ideas, you start to realize, whether true or false, that's a distraction.
Yep.
And I don't have time for distractions.
Yep.
I'm aiming at the most important things a person can aim at, and I'm going to stick with that.
Smith and Robinson.